precisely the latitude of 28 degrees north, a strange and invisible distortion begins to pull at pieces of magnetized iron. In the late autumn of 1492, the helmsman gripping the massive wooden tillers of 3 isolated ships noticed something that had never been documented in maritime travel. The iron needle floating in their brass compass bowls no longer aligned with the North Star. This was the phenomenon of magnetic declination, a vast and unseen warping of the Earth's magnetic field that silently shifts the compass needle away from true geographical north. In the middle of an uncharted ocean, the very laws of physics seemed to be bending in the dark. The Atlantic night was not merely dark. It was an absolute, suffocating blanket of blackness, broken only by the cold, distant light of the stars and the faint, phosphorescent glow of bioluminescent plankton churning in the wake of the wooden hulls. The air was heavy with the sharp scent of atomized brine, rotting kelp, and the odor of pine tar melting into the seams of the oak decking. The silence of the ocean was a myth, replaced entirely by the relentless groaning of strained timber, the snapping of wet canvas, and the indifferent roaring of water, displaced by heavy bows. What if I told you that the greatest myth of this entire voyage, the story repeated in countless classrooms and textbooks, is the idea that these sailors were terrified of sailing off the edge of a flat Earth? The truth is far more fascinating and deeply rooted in mathematics. By the year 1492, every educated person, every seasoned navigator, and every monarch across the European continent knew perfectly well that the Earth was a sphere. The ancient Greeks had proved it. Eratosthenes had measured its circumference with astonishing accuracy centuries before. The actual terrifying debate was not about the shape of the world, but about its sheer, insurmountable size. The scholars in Salamanca who rejected this expedition did not do so out of a superstitious fear of a cosmic cliff. They rejected it because their mathematics were correct. They calculated the true distance to the eastern coast of Asia and knew that no wooden vessel of that era could carry enough water and provisions to survive a journey of 10,000 miles across an empty, open ocean. The voyage was approved not because of visionary genius, but because of a monumental miscalculation, a stubborn belief in an Earth much smaller than reality dictated. If you're using this to fall asleep, that's exactly what this is for. So get comfortable, maybe subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. Whether you are settling into the quiet hours of the night in Boston, or listening as the early morning light begins to wash over the damp streets of London and Berlin, the vastness of human history offers a quiet sanctuary from the noise of the present moment. Out on that endless expanse of water, 90 men were suspended in a state of perilous isolation, entirely dependent on the structural integrity of 3 small vessels. The flagship, the Santa Maria, was a heavy, cumbersome merchant vessel known as a now, designed for hauling cargo along the predictable coasts of the Mediterranean, not for piercing the unknown depths of an alien ocean. She was barely the length of a modern tennis court, yet carried a crew of 40 men. The other 2, the Pinta and the Nina, were caravels, lighter and significantly smaller, bobbing like fragile corks in the deep Atlantic swells. Below decks, the atmosphere was thick, claustrophobic, and intensely humid. The hull was packed tightly with wooden casks held together by rusted iron hoops, filled with fresh water that was already beginning to bloom with green algae. There were barrels of salted beef, sacks of hardened hardtack infested with weevils, and clay amphorae of wine that slowly turned to bitter vinegar. For the ordinary sailors, there were no sleeping quarters, no private spaces of any kind. When a man finished his grueling watch, he simply collapsed onto the open deck, wherever he could find a few feet of space among the coiled hemp ropes, spare canvas sails, and crude wooden pens holding live sheep and pigs. They slept exposed to the driving rain, the biting sea spray, and the blistering sun. The biological reality of this existence was profound. Their skin was constantly coated in a thin layer of dried sea salt, their muscles aching from the relentless effort of balancing on a deck that never ceased moving, pitching and rolling in complex, unpredictable geometries. The survival of these 90 souls rested entirely on the ancient, incredibly demanding science of dead reckoning. Every single day, the pilots had to calculate their position on a featureless blue plane using only speed, time, and direction. Time was kept by a half-hour glass, a fragile contraption of wood, brass, and meticulously sifted sand. A young ship's boy was tasked with watching this glass continuously, turning it the exact moment the final grain slipped through the narrow throat, and ringing a bell to mark the passage of time. If the boy fell asleep for even a minute, the entire temporal reality of the ship was thrown into chaos. To calculate speed, they relied on a simple piece of wood tied to a knotted rope thrown over the stern. By counting how many knots passed through their hands as sand drained from a smaller glass, they could estimate their velocity. This mathematical data was then meticulously recorded on a traverse board, an exercise in pure, objective concentration. As September bled into October, the geography of the ocean itself began to transform. They entered a region now known as the Sargasso Sea, a massive, slow-moving gyre in the middle of the North Atlantic, where the water becomes eerily calm, trapped within the circulating currents of the trade winds. Here, the ocean surface was choked with vast mats of free-floating brown macroalgae stretching for hundreds of miles. To the modern marine biologist, this is a vibrant ecosystem. But to the men of 1492, staring out at an ocean that looked more like a flooded meadow than a navigable body of water, it was a terrifying anomaly. The wind died down. The ship slowed to a torturous crawl, their heavy wooden hulls dragging through the thick vegetation. The fear that took root in their minds was not of sea monsters or the edge of the world, but of a quiet, agonizing death by starvation, stranded where the wind would forever abandon them. Every day that passed without the sight of land stretched the tension to a microscopic thinness. The horizon remained an unbroken, perfectly horizontal line, a sharp division between the blue-black abyss of the deep water and the pale blue of the sky. In this environment, the human mind struggles to comprehend the scale of its own insignificance. A single drop of sweat falling from the brow of a terrified sailor lands on the rough grain of an oak plank, evaporating instantly into the humid, salty air, absorbed by the vast, atmospheric machine of the ocean. Below them, thousands of feet of dark, pressurized water operate on a timeline entirely divorced from the brief, frantic lives floating on the surface above. When a human being is placed in the center of such an immense, uncaring environment, all the complex hierarchies, political ambitions, and economic desperation that drove them out onto the water are stripped away. reduced to the fundamental biological reality of survival. The distance between a fragile wooden ship and the solid Earth is not merely a measurement of miles, but a vast, silent gap between the known and the incomprehensible. History is often written as a series of bold decisions and triumphant discoveries, yet at its core, the reality of exploration is an exercise in profound, terrifying isolation. It is the experience of being suspended in a void, completely severed from the familiar weight of the earth, waiting in the darkness to see where the slow, indifferent mechanics of the ocean currents will finally lead beneath the surface of the warm western Atlantic. Resting on a submerged platform of ancient limestone, the architecture of an entirely different world had been quietly assembling itself for millions of years, long before the heavy wooden hulls of European ships began to carve their way through the Sargasso Sea. Countless generations of microscopic marine polyps had lived, reproduced, and died in the shallow, sunlit waters, slowly depositing microscopic layers of calcium carbonate over incomprehensible spans of geological time. These monumental coral reefs built the foundation of a vast archipelago, stretching across hundreds of miles of ocean. The steady, relentless push of the trade winds, carrying the infinite breadth of the sea, ground the dead coral and shattered mollusk shells into a fine, blindingly white sand, piling it against the shallow shoals until land masses finally broke the surface of the water. This was the Lucayan archipelago, a sprawling network of low-lying islands and coys, completely isolated from the massive, continent-spanning conflicts and biological exchanges of the Eurasian landmass. On one specific island, a place defined by its gentle, rolling dunes, thick mangrove swamps, and a vast, hypersaline lake resting in its interior, a profoundly sophisticated human ecology had reached a state of deep, undisturbed equilibrium. The indigenous people called this island Guanahani. The human presence on Guanahani was not an accident of nature, but the result of a deliberate, slow-moving migration that had begun thousands of years earlier, deep within the immense emerald watershed of the Orinoco River Basin in South America. Generation by generation, Arawakan-speaking families had navigated their way northward, island hopping across the Lesser and Greater Antilles, carrying with them an entire portable biosphere of seeds, roots, and profound botanical knowledge. By the time they settled in the Bahamas, becoming the Lucayan Taino, they had mastered the exact carrying capacity of their fragile limestone environment. They did not conquer the landscape with deep steel plows or clear-cut the forests for vast single-crop pastures, because the thin, nutrient-poor topsoil of the islands would have rapidly washed away into the ocean under the heavy torrential rains of the wet season. Instead, they engineered the earth through a highly advanced, sustainable agricultural system based on the canuco. These canucos were large, meticulously constructed mounds of loose soil, dead leaves, and ash, carefully arranged to prevent soil erosion, retain precious moisture during the dry season, and naturally aerate the root systems of their crops. Within these carefully cultivated mounds, the Taino planted a complex, interdependent polyculture of sweet potatoes, beans, maize, and peanuts. But the absolute foundation of their civilization was a remarkable root vegetable known as cassava. The cultivation and processing of bitter cassava by the Taino women represented a staggering achievement of empirical biochemistry. The roots of the bitter cassava plant are rich in complex carbohydrates and can grow in the harshest, most unforgiving soils. but they evolved a lethal defense mechanism to protect themselves from insects and grazing animals. The raw flesh of the root is packed with linemerin, a cyanogenic glucoside that, when crushed or chewed, releases a highly toxic, lethal dose of hydrogen cyanide gas. To transform this deadly root into the staple food of their entire civilization, the Taino developed a rigorous, multi-step industrial process. They would harvest the heavy tubers, peel them with sharpened shells, and vigorously grate the white flesh into a wet, toxic pulp on rough boards embedded with sharp stones. This pulp was then tightly packed into a sebacon, a brilliantly engineered, diagonally woven, cylindrical basket made from palm leaves. By hanging the sebacon from a tree branch and attaching a heavy weight or using a wooden lever at the bottom, the woven cylinder would stretch and contract, squeezing the poisonous, milky cyanide juice out of the pulp and into clay pots below. The remaining dry, detoxified flour was then sifted and baked on large, flat clay griddles over open fires to create kasab, a dense, highly nutritious flatbread that could last for months without spoiling in the intense, tropical heat. This meticulous, daily chemical engineering allowed tens of thousands of people to thrive in an environment that would later starve European colonists who lacked the knowledge of the Canuco and the Cebucan. The society built upon this foundation of cassava was completely devoid of the heavy industrial markers that defined 15th century Europe. There were no beasts of burden, no iron smelting, no wheeled carts, and no deep shaft mining. Their architecture was composed of large, circular dwellings called bohíos, constructed from perfectly bound mahogany poles and tightly thatched palm leaves, designed to breathe in the suffocating humidity and flex violently without collapsing during the catastrophic force of seasonal hurricanes. Their mastery of hydrodynamics was not expressed in heavy, leaking, timber-framed caravels, but in magnificent dugout canoes carved from the single, massive trunks of ancient ceiba trees. Using controlled fire and polished stone adzes, they hollowed out the dense wood, shaping vessels that were impossibly sleek and fast, capable of carrying up to 100 rowers across the deep trenches of the Caribbean Sea, maintaining an intricate network of trade, marriage, and communication between the islands. It was a civilization perfectly adapted to the thermodynamics and the strict biological limitations of the tropics. On the eastern shoreline of Guanahani, as the deep indigo darkness of the night began to gradually dilute into the pale, bruised purple of the approaching dawn, the rhythmic, endless sound of the Atlantic swells breaking against the offshore barrier reef was the only sound echoing across the beach. The air was cool, carrying the sharp, metallic scent of ozone and the rich, earthy decay of the mangrove swamps behind the dunes. A single observer, stepping out from the edge of the sea grapes, walked down toward the wet, compacted sand where the tide was retreating. The water washing over the smooth tops of their feet was perfectly clear, magnifying the crushed fragments of pink conch shells and the pale, translucent bodies of small crustaceans burying themselves in the wet sand. The routine of the morning was governed by the predictable, ancient cycles of the tides and the shifting patterns of the trade winds, a reality that had remained unbroken for 1,000 years. Looking out past the churning white foam of the reef, the horizon line was typically a vast, empty division between the pale blue of the morning sky and the darker, heavier blue of the deep ocean, disturbed only by the familiar silhouette of a distant rain squall or the low, streamlined profile of a neighboring trading canoe. But on this specific morning, the geometry of the horizon was violently disrupted. Resting heavily in the deep water, rolling awkwardly in the swells, were three colossal, unnatural structures. They did not look like ships, for the very concept of a multi-decked, iron-fastened carrack with towering masts did not exist in the biological or technological vocabulary of the observer. They appeared as bizarre, floating islands of dead, dark wood, draped in massive sheets of dirty, salt-stained cloth that hung limp in the morning air. The sheer, grotesque scale of the objects, the unnatural, sharp angles of their rigging, and the complete absence of paddles or outriggers made them entirely alien to the established taxonomy of the natural world. There was no immediate panic, no sudden realization of impending doom, only the quiet, profound cognitive dissonance of a human mind struggling to categorize an impossibility that has suddenly manifested into physical reality. The isolated equilibrium of the Lucayan archipelago, held in perfect, delicate suspension for centuries, was completely unaware that the invisible boundary separating two entirely different evolutionary and cultural timelines had just been permanently breached. The vast, slow-moving biological wave of the outside world had finally washed up onto the shore, and the quiet harmony of an isolated ecosystem stood trembling at the very edge of an unimaginable transformation. The wet, compacted sand of the Bahamian shoreline offered a brief, solid resistance as the heavy wooden keels of the European longboats scraped against the shallow sea floor. For the men gripping the oars, the physical sensation of the earth beneath them was a jarring, profound shock to a nervous system that had been conditioned by 33 days of ceaseless, chaotic motion. The water surrounding their leather boots was a brilliant, impossible shade of cyan, heated by the tropical sun to a temperature completely alien to the freezing, dark swells of the North Atlantic. As the men stepped out into the surf, dragging the heavy timber onto the beach, the atmosphere was suffocatingly thick. They were dressed in the heavy, woven wools of Iberian autumns, tightly laced leather doublets, and sheets of hammered iron armor that immediately began to bake against their skin, trapping their sweat in a sweltering, claustrophobic layer. The air they breathed was dense with humidity, carrying the unfamiliar chemical signatures of exotic pollens, decaying mangrove leaves, and the sweet, heavy scent of tropical resins. They stood on the edge of the water, a tightly clustered group of exhausted, unwashed men, gripping polished steel swords and holding aloft a heavy fabric banner embroidered with the green cross of the Spanish monarchy. A few yards away, stepping out from the shadowed periphery of the sea grape trees, the indigenous Taino inhabitants of Guanahani observed this arrival with a cautious, intense focus. They were completely unburdened by the heavy textiles and metals of the strangers, their skin exposed to the humid air, intricately painted with red, black, and white pigments extracted from local seeds and clays. The physical space between these two groups of human beings, separated by merely a few stretches of white sand and tidal pools, represented one of the most profound biological and sociological chasms in the history of the planet. To look at these two groups standing face to face is to witness the closing of a colossal, prehistoric circle. Tens of thousands of years earlier, deep within the Pleistocene epoch, The distant ancestors of every person on that beach had shared a common lineage. But as ancient migratory groups slowly pushed outward, tracing the edges of receding glaciers, a massive fracture occurred. One lineage expanded across the vast expanses of Eurasia, eventually developing the heavy metallurgical and maritime technologies that produced the caravels anchored offshore. The other lineage had crossed the frozen, exposed land bridge of Beringia into the Americas before the warming Earth melted the ice caps, causing the oceans to rise by hundreds of feet and swallowing the bridge entirely. For 15,000 years, two halves of the human family had lived, evolved, and built civilizations in absolute, unbroken isolation from one another. Now, on this quiet morning, the ocean that had acted as a planetary vault was finally breached, and the two lineages stared at one another across the sand. The silence of that initial encounter was broken by the sound of a human voice, but the noise carried no shared meaning. The European commander drew his sword, planted the wooden shaft of the royal standard into the soft earth, and began to read aloud from a prepared legal document. He commanded the air, the sand, and the watching Taino to bear witness that he was taking formal possession of this land in the name of distant monarchs, as the phonetic syllables of 15th century Castilian Spanish left his throat. They vibrated through the dense tropical air, traveling as acoustic waves until they struck the eardrums of the Taino observers. But the complex cognitive architecture required to decode those vibrations simply did not exist on this side of the Atlantic. To the Taino, the legal declarations, the names of foreign gods, and the complex geopolitical claims were reduced to mere biological noise, a string of meaningless, guttural sounds fading into the gentle crashing of the surf. The Spanish were speaking into a void, projecting the strict, codified laws of the old world onto a landscape that had never heard them, and upon a people who had no conceptual framework for the idea that an island could be claimed by speaking words at it. To bridge this insurmountable void of language, the two groups instinctively turned to the most fundamental mechanism of human interaction: the physical exchange of matter. The Europeans, eager to establish a connection and assess the material wealth of the inhabitants, reached into their leather pouches and pulled out small, beautifully manufactured objects of absolutely no economic value in their own societies. They offered small red caps, brass hawk bells designed for European falconry, and handfuls of brightly colored glass beads. These beads were a marvel of Renaissance chemistry, produced in the blazing furnaces of Murano, Venice. To make them, artisans melted silica sand with specific metallic oxides: cobalt for deep blue, copper for turquoise, stretching the molten glass into long, thin canes before chopping them into tiny, perfectly spherical drops of frozen light. To the Taino, whose material culture was built upon organic, biodegradable elements like wood, bone, shell, and cotton, these dense, perfectly smooth, vividly colored stones that caught the tropical sun were objects of intense fascination. They were unlike anything the geology of the Lucayan archipelago could produce. In return, the Taino offered the wealth of their own carefully managed biosphere. They handed the strangers heavy, beautifully spun skeins of pristine white cotton, cultivated in their complex agricultural mounds. They offered wooden throwing darts, perfectly balanced and polished, tipped not with iron, but with the sharp, calcified teeth of sharks, and Most strikingly, they offered live, brilliantly plumed parrots, holding the vibrant green and red birds out to the heavily armored men. As the Venetian glass rested in the calloused palms of the Taino, and the living, breathing biology of the Caribbean was passed into the hands of the Spanish sailors, a quiet, monumental tragedy of perception was unfolding. Each side was filtering the exchange through a profoundly incompatible understanding of reality. The European mind, shaped by the frantic, debt-ridden mercantilism of the expanding Renaissance, looked at the Taino and saw only raw data to be categorized and exploited. They scanned the bodies of the indigenous people not for shared humanity, but for the soft, yellow gleam of gold ornaments, desperately trying to map this lush, unfamiliar environment onto the written descriptions of Asia provided by Marco Polo. When the Taino spoke, trying to explain their names, their islands, and their complex networks of trade, the Europeans only listened for phonetic approximations of the Great Khan or the fabled cities of the East. They were entirely trapped within the rigid confines of their own geographical illusions. Conversely, the Taino, looking at these exhausted, foul-smelling men who had arrived in floating wooden mountains, tried to place them within their own rich cosmological order. They noted the lack of women among the strangers, the unnatural pale tone of their skin, and their complete ignorance of the local ecology. They traded their parrots and cotton not as an act of economic submission, but as an ancient, established diplomatic protocol, a way to weave these bizarre newcomers into the complex social fabric of the islands. They had no way of knowing that the small glass beads they held were not gifts of reciprocity, but the opening gestures of an extractive, global machine that would soon consume their entire world. The sand beneath their feet, composed of millions of crushed shells, absorbed the footprints of both the naked and the heavily booted. In the space between them, the physical objects crossed the divide, but the minds remained locked in entirely separate universes. It is a haunting realization that the most pivotal moment in the history of human globalization was not defined by a sudden, brilliant flash of mutual understanding, but by a profound, impenetrable silence. The tragedy of the encounter was not found in what was spoken, but in the vast, invisible architecture of meaning that simply could not be translated. History, in its most transformative moments, is rarely shaped by clarity. It is forged in the deep, quiet spaces of profound misunderstanding, where two worlds collide, trade their simplest fragments, and look into each other's eyes without seeing anything of the truth. When the calloused, salt-stained hand of a Castilian sailor reached out to grasp the smooth, painted wrist of a Taino man, the most consequential exchange of that morning was not the passing of glass beads or the presentation of spun cotton. It was an event occurring entirely beyond the threshold of human vision. As the two men stood mere inches apart on the blinding white sands of Guanahani, the rapid, shallow exhalations of the exhausted European expelled a microscopic cloud of aerosolized droplets into the humid, tropical air. Suspended within these microscopic spheres of moisture, drifting silently on the gentle currents of the ocean breeze, was a biological payload forged over millennia in the densely packed, disease-ridden cities of the Old World. Millions of viral particles and bacterial agents, invisible and weightless, crossed the imperceptible gap between their faces and were drawn deep into the warm, unprotected lungs of the indigenous hosts. To comprehend the devastating, hidden asymmetry of this microscopic collision, one must look deep into the ancient, slow-moving currents of human migration and the agonizing grind of the last ice age, when the ancestors of the Taino crossed the frozen, exposed expanse of the Bering Land Bridge tens of thousands of years earlier. The brutal, sub-zero temperatures of the Arctic acted as a profound, uncompromising biological filter. The intense, prolonged cold eradicated many of the fragile pathogens that had plagued early hominid populations in the warmer climates of Africa and Asia. Furthermore, as these ancient nomadic groups migrated south, slowly populating the vast, untouched continents of the Americas, they did so entirely without the presence of large, domesticable herd animals. There were no massive flocks of sheep crowding their settlements, no herds of cattle sharing their water sources, and no domesticated pigs living in close proximity to their dwellings. In the dense, complex ecosystems of the Eurasian landmass, these very animals had served as the evolutionary crucibles for the most lethal zoonotic diseases in human history. Pathogens like the variola virus responsible for smallpox, or the highly contagious morbillivirus that causes measles, had spent thousands of years slowly adapting, mutating, and eventually crossing the species barrier from livestock to humans. Over countless generations of catastrophic plagues, urban epidemics, and unending cycles of sickness, the populations of Europe and Asia had paid a staggering demographic and biological price to cultivate a hardened, inherited immunological armor. The bloodstreams of the Spanish sailors anchored off the Bahamian coast carried the memory of this suffering in the form of specific antibodies. They were walking, breathing reservoirs of endemic pathogens that their own immune systems had learned to suppress and manage, maintaining a fragile internal truce. But the immune systems of the Taino, having evolved in absolute, magnificent isolation from these specific viral strains, possessed no such chemical memory. Their white blood cells, their macrophages and T cells, were highly adapted and incredibly effective against local tropical parasites, bacterial infections from coral cuts, and the unique environmental hazards of the Caribbean archipelago. However, they were entirely blind to the molecular architecture of these foreign invaders. When a single virion of a Eurasian pathogen made contact with the respiratory epithelium of a Taino islander, the cellular defenses simply did not recognize the threat. The virus seamlessly bound itself to the receptors on the outside of the host cell, like a microscopic key sliding into a lock, and injected its genetic material with terrifying mechanical precision. Inside the host cell, the viral RNA hijacked the complex internal machinery, reprogramming the cellular functions to cease normal operations. The cell was instantly transformed into a microscopic factory, frantically assembling thousands of new viral particles until its membrane violently ruptured, sending a catastrophic cascade of infection pouring into the bloodstream. Because there were no pre-existing antibodies to identify and neutralize this rapid replication, the resulting immune response was often delayed and then chaotic and overwhelming. The indigenous bodies mounted a desperate, systemic defense that resulted in massive inflammation, uncontrollable fevers, and rapid physiological collapse, destroyed not only by the virus itself, but by the violent overreaction of their own defenseless immune systems. Yet, the invisible cargo carried across the Atlantic was not limited solely to human pathogens. Hidden deeply within the tightly woven woolen fibers of the Europeans' heavy clothing, caught in the dried, compacted mud, caked onto the soles of their leather boots, and nestled within the dark, damp crevices of the wooden ships. An entire botanical and entomological invasion was waiting to disembark. Seeds of aggressive Eurasian weeds like dandelion and plantain, spores of foreign fungi, and the microscopic eggs of invasive insects were carried onto the island. When the sailors shook out their blankets or scraped their boots on the limestone rocks, they inadvertently introduced organisms that would soon wage a silent, relentless war against the delicate, highly specialized flora of the Caribbean. Even the soil itself would be irrevocably altered. The heavy, iron-bound casks of earth brought as ballast in the lower decks contained old-world earthworms, creatures entirely absent from the northern Americas since the glaciers retreated. Once released into the soil, they would begin to aggressively re-engineer the forest floor, consuming the leaf litter at a rate the native trees were completely unaccustomed to. This biological exchange, the most profound reshaping of life on Earth since the extinction of the dinosaurs, was not an isolated event contained to a single beach on a single morning. As the European ships hoisted their heavy canvas sails and moved onward from Guanahani to the larger, densely populated landmasses of Cuba and Hispaniola, the invisible payload was dispersed with every single physical interaction. With every shared meal, every traded object, and every breath spoken in the close, humid quarters of a Taino bohio, the microscopic wave expanded. From these initial, scattered points of contact, a devastating biological vanguard began to radiate outward, carried along the ancient, sophisticated, indigenous trade routes by the very canoes that had connected the islands for centuries. It moved invisibly, traveling far faster than the European explorers themselves. It swept through hidden valleys, across towering mountain ranges, and deep into the dense, impenetrable rainforests of the mainland. Entire communities and sprawling empires that had never seen a pale-skinned stranger, a horse, or a wooden sailing ship were suddenly and inexplicably struck by catastrophic waves of fever and disease. Their carefully managed populations were decimated by an enemy that left no physical footprint, spoke no language, and could not be fought with weapons of polished stone or hardened wood. The grand narratives of human history are most often preoccupied with the conscious, deliberate actions of men. We focus our attention on the signing of royal decrees, the clash of steel swords, the strategic mapping of coastlines, and the sudden, violent shifts in political power. Yet, beneath the threshold of human perception, a far more powerful and terrifyingly indifferent mechanism was set into motion the exact moment those two isolated worlds physically intersected. The true, undisputed architects of the centuries that followed were not kings or navigators, but replicating proteins, fungal spores, and viral structures operating on a scale so infinitesimally small that they escaped notice entirely. It is a profound and humbling realization that the vast, complex structures of human civilizations built over millennia of careful adaptation and immense labor can be entirely unraveled, not by the deliberate malice of a conquering army, but by the quiet, inexorable mathematics of cellular biology and the invisible breath of a stranger. As the heavy canvas sails of the 3 Iberian vessels caught the steady, invisible push of the eastern trade winds, carrying them away from the shallow, blindingly white banks of Guanahani, a profound and dangerous psychological mechanism began to engage within the mind of the expedition's commander. The physical reality of the Lucayan archipelago, a fragile, isolated ecosystem inhabited by people living in absolute, harmonious equilibrium with their environment, was not merely a disappointment. It was an existential threat to the very foundation of the voyage. The venture that brought these wooden ships across the vast, terrifying expanse of the dark Atlantic was not an exercise in pure scientific curiosity or abstract geographical exploration. It was, at its absolute core, a heavily leveraged, high-stakes corporate enterprise, financed by the weary monarchs of Castile and Aragon, and underwritten by a complex network of Italian banking syndicates and wealthy Andalusian merchants. The ledgers of 1492 demanded an astronomical return on investment, a return that could only be paid in the universal, heavy currencies of the Old World. Massive, easily exploitable veins of pure gold, bales of shimmering, tightly woven silk, and the violently expensive, intensely aromatic spices of the East Indies. When the flagship, the Santa Maria, ground its heavy keel through the deep turquoise waters toward the massive, sprawling landmass of Cuba, the commander stood on the aft deck, gripping a weathered, leather-bound copy of Marco Polo's Travels and a collection of ancient, heavily annotated maps. He was not looking at the dense, emerald-green mountain ranges rising majestically into the humid, tropical clouds. He was not observing the intricate, ancient mangrove forests that grip the coastline in a tangled, impenetrable lattice of salt-encrusted roots. Instead, he was frantically trying to force this completely alien, unrecorded geography to perfectly align with the rigid, centuries-old text of his books. The mind of the navigator was operating under an immense, crushing pressure to transform the unknown into the highly profitable known. In the dense, suffocating heat of the Cuban coastline, a bizarre and deeply melancholic theater of misinterpretation began to play out. The Spanish ships dropped their heavy iron anchors in the quiet, pristine bays, and small parties of heavily armed, sweating men were dispatched into the thick, buzzing jungle. Among them was Luis de Torres, a scholar who spoke fluent Arabic and Hebrew, the languages the Europeans confidently believed would serve as the bridge to the great commercial hubs of the Asian mainland. They marched through the undergrowth, their heavy leather boots sinking into the damp, decomposing leaf litter of an ecosystem entirely untouched by large-scale human industry. They were searching for the magnificent, marble-columned palaces of the Great Khan, roofs tiled with thick plates of solid gold, and sprawling, chaotic markets smelling of black pepper, clove, and cinnamon. What they found, nestled in the quiet clearings beneath the towering canopies of ancient mahogany and ceiba trees, were peaceful Taino villages. There were no golden pavilions, only beautifully constructed bohíos made of woven palm leaves. There was no pungent aroma of roasting spices, only the thick blue smoke of dried leaves burning in small earthen pipes. The world's first European encounter with tobacco. When the indigenous people presented them with the resin of the mastic tree or the thick, gelatinous leaves of the aloe plant, the Europeans eagerly recorded these discoveries as the highly lucrative spices and medicinal drugs of the Orient. Every single piece of botanical evidence was forcefully bent, stripped of its actual biological context, and hammered into the pre-existing economic framework. of the expedition as the ships continued to map the jagged, infinitely complex northern coast of Cuba. The physical act of cartography slowly mutated into an exercise in pure delusion. The commander's quill scratched across the rough, fibrous surface of the parchment in his cabin, illuminated by the flickering, unsteady light of a single tallow candle. He was drawing a coastline that he desperately needed to be the easternmost peninsula of the Asian continent. When the Taino guides, trying to explain the geography of their own home, pointed toward the mountainous center of the island and spoke the word Cubanacan, meaning the middle of Cuba, the commander's ears captured only the phonetic fragments he desired. He recorded in his heavy, leather-bound journal that the natives were speaking of El Gran Khan, the Great Khan. The linguistic chasm was no longer merely a barrier to communication. It had become an active, willing instrument of profound self-deception. This internal mapping of a reality that did not exist reached its most terrifying apex when the expedition finally turned eastward, navigating the deep, treacherous windward passage toward a massive, imposing island the Taino called Ayiti. The geography here shifted dramatically. The mountains rose higher into the cold, thin air. The valleys were vast and plunging, and the rivers ran fast and clear over beds of ancient, crushed rock. To the European eye, the topography bore a haunting, comforting resemblance to the rugged, sun-baked landscapes of Andalusia, prompting the commander to name it La Isla Española, Hispaniola. It was here, in the shallow, rushing waters of the interior rivers, that the indigenous people possessed small, hammered flakes of alluvial gold, worn as delicate, subtle ornaments in their noses and ears. For the Taino, the gold was a sacred, aesthetic material, valued for its beauty and its reflection of the sun, entirely divorced from any concept of currency, debt, or accumulation. For the desperate minds of the Europeans, these tiny, insignificant flakes were the ultimate, undeniable validation of their fragile, constructed reality. The sight of the yellow metal triggered a catastrophic failure of objective observation. The microscopic flecks of river gold were instantly magnified in the minds of the sailors into the mythical, endless, subterranean veins of Chipangu. The staggering mathematical impossibility of their location, the biological absurdity of the flora and fauna, and the complete absence of any recognizable Asian civilization were entirely overwritten by the intoxicating yellow gleam resting in the palm of an indigenous hand. The geography of illusion is not simply a matter of drawing the wrong lines on a piece of parchment. It is a terrifying testament to the sheer, overwhelming power of human desperation when a mind is anchored by an insurmountable weight, whether it is the crushing burden of a sovereign debt, the rigid dogma of an ancient text, or the simple, terrifying inability to admit that one is lost in an endless, alien void. It will completely reject the objective evidence presented by the physical world. The eye will see a simple, palm leaf hut and report a towering fortress. The ear will hear a foreign syllable and translate it into the name of a phantom emperor. It is a slow, quiet observation of human nature that we are rarely destroyed by the unknown itself. Rather, we are unmade by our absolute, unyielding refusal to accept the unknown for what it is, choosing instead to forcefully wrap the vast, indifferent mysteries of the world in the familiar, comforting lies we tell ourselves in the dark. On the deeply shadowed evening of December the 24th, under a canopy of cold, indifferent winter stars. The vast, churning machinery of the Atlantic Ocean had briefly settled into a deceptive, glassy stillness off the northern coast of Hispaniola. The heavy, cumbersome flagship of the expedition, the Santa Maria, was drifting slowly through the dark, warm waters, her massive canvas sails hanging completely limp from the towering pine masts. For weeks, the 90 men aboard the 3 vessels had been pushed to the absolute breaking point of human endurance, their nervous systems frayed by the relentless, chaotic motion of the sea, the constant threat of starvation, and the profound psychological weight of navigating an unmapped reality. On this specific night, with the ocean so unusually calm and the air heavy with the sweet, humid scent of the nearby tropical landmass, an overwhelming biological exhaustion overtook the crew. The master of the ship, defying the strict, ancient maritime laws of the sea, abandoned his post at the heavy wooden tiller, leaving the entire navigational fate of the 100-ton vessel in the hands of an inexperienced young cabin boy. Beneath the perfectly calm surface of the water, a massive, ancient biological architecture was waiting in the dark. For millennia, colonies of microscopic coral polyps had been extracting calcium carbonate from the ocean, painstakingly constructing a vast, razor-sharp labyrinth of submerged limestone reefs. These reefs were completely invisible in the pitch-black night, betraying no breaking waves or shifting foam to warn the approaching vessel. The physical collision between the heavy, industrialized ambition of 15th century Europe and the ancient, silent biology of the Caribbean did not occur with a dramatic, thunderous crash. Instead, it began with a slow, sickening vibration that traveled up through the heavy oak keel, a deep, resonant groaning of stressed timber that slowly amplified into the violent, terrifying sound of iron-hard limestone tearing through thick wooden planks. The young boy at the tiller cried out into the dark as the kinetic energy of the drifting ship was abruptly halted, her massive hull driving itself firmly into the unyielding grip of the coral bank. In an instant, the deep, hypnotic silence of the night was shattered by the frantic, chaotic geometry of a disaster. Men poured out from below decks, their bare feet slipping on the angled, wet wood, instantly, violently awakened from their exhaustion into a terrifying fight for survival. The ocean, operating entirely on the indifferent, gravitational pull of the moon, began its slow, inevitable tidal retreat. As the water level dropped, the Santa Maria lost the buoyant support of the sea. Her massive, heavy bulk rolled awkwardly onto her side, exposing her most vulnerable seams to the crushing weight of her own cargo and the unforgiving edges of the reef. The thick iron bolts began to violently snap under the impossible torsion, and the meticulously caulked seams of oakum and pitch instantly burst open, allowing the dark, warm seawater to flood rapidly into the lower holds, consuming the precious reserves of dried grain, gunpowder, and fresh water. When the pale, bruised light of the morning sun finally broke across the horizon, it illuminated a scene of profound and devastating finality. The great Galician now, the flagship that had traversed 3,000 miles of uncharted abyss, was utterly destroyed, reduced to a broken, helpless carcass, impaled on the rocks. Yet, the tragedy of the shipwreck immediately forced a complex, unprecedented sociological interaction on the shores of this alien world. The local Taino cacique, a deeply influential leader named Guacanagari, observed the stranded, desperate strangers from the beach. Instead of reacting with hostility or seizing the opportunity to eliminate these heavily armed intruders. He mobilized the entire logistical capacity of his people in a massive, coordinated rescue operation. Dozens of massive, beautifully carved dugout canoes, some capable of holding 50 rowers, pushed off from the white sands and glided efficiently through the turquoise waters toward the sinking wreckage. The indigenous people, possessing a profound athletic mastery of the marine environment, worked tirelessly alongside the exhausted, armored Europeans. They dove into the flooded, darkened holds of the Santa Maria, retrieving heavy, waterlogged barrels, iron cannons, and fragile navigational instruments, transporting the entire salvaged anatomy of the ship safely to the shoreline. The Europeans, conditioned by the ruthless, highly competitive mercantilism of the Old World, were entirely bewildered by this display of uncalculated, systemic empathy. They stood on the beach, their wet clothes baking in the intense tropical heat, watching as the people they had secretly hoped to subjugate worked with incredible efficiency to save their lives and their cargo, asking for absolutely nothing in return. With the flagship permanently lost to the sea, the fundamental nature of the expedition underwent a sudden, involuntary transformation. The two remaining caravels, the Pinta and the Niña, were far too small to accommodate the stranded crew of the Santa Maria, along with the remaining provisions necessary for a brutal winter crossing of the Atlantic. The mathematics of survival dictated a harsh, unavoidable reality. Some of the men would have to be left behind. Out of this desperate necessity, the broken, salvaged skeleton of the ship was painstakingly repurposed. The men who had crossed the ocean as sailors and explorers were immediately transformed into laborers and carpenters. They dragged the massive, waterlogged oak timbers, the heavy iron fasteners, and the splintered masts up onto the dry earth. They began to dig deep, defensive trenches into the soft soil of Hispaniola, erecting a crude, heavily fortified structure, using the very wood that had carried them across the void. They named this sudden, unnatural settlement La Navidad, in honor of the Christmas day on which their ship was destroyed. The construction of the fort was a slow, agonizing process of deconstruction and reassembly. The elegant, hydrodynamic curves of the ship's ribs were forcefully straightened and driven into the earth to form jagged palisades. The heavy bronze bombard cannons, designed to fire stone spheres at enemy vessels on the open sea, were dragged through the mud and mounted on primitive wooden platforms, pointing blindly out toward the dense, impenetrable wall of the tropical jungle. A structure entirely engineered for constant, fluid motion had been violently killed and resurrected as a static, fearful monument to isolation. When the primitive fortress was finally completed, 39 men were selected to remain. They were a mixture of common sailors, carpenters, a tailor, and a physician, suddenly burdened with the unimaginable psychological weight of representing an entire hemisphere on the shores of an alien world. As the early days of January arrived, the cold, powerful trade winds shifted, offering the remaining caravel a narrow window for departure. The men of La Navidad stood on the shoreline, feeling the abrasive white sand beneath their boots, and watched in total, absolute silence as the small, fragile sails of the Niña slowly dissolved into the vast, blue horizon. The moment the ship disappeared, the true, crushing scale of their isolation descended upon the fort. The familiar, rhythmic sounds of maritime life, the snapping of canvas, the turning of the hourglass, the barking of orders in Castilian Spanish, were instantly swallowed by the overwhelming alien acoustics of the Caribbean biosphere. The dense jungle behind them was alive with the chaotic hum of millions of insects, the sharp cries of unfamiliar birds, and the rustling of unseen animals in the thick, humid undergrowth. They were disconnected from the entire known world by an ocean that took months to cross, surrounded by a complex indigenous society they did not understand, guarding a stockpile of salvaged goods and worthless trinkets in a fortress made of dead wood. To be left behind by the tide of history is to experience a profoundly unique state of suspended animation. The 39 men of La Navidad were essentially trapped in a spatial and temporal void, clinging desperately to the decaying remnants of their past, while completely unequipped to survive the reality of their present. They built their walls and loaded their cannons, operating under the tragic, deeply human illusion that rearranging the fragmented pieces of a broken ship could somehow protect them from the vast and different expanse of an entirely new world. It is a quiet, melancholic truth that the structures we build in our moments of greatest desperation, whether they are fortresses of heavy timber or the rigid walls of our own internal beliefs, are ultimately fragile, impermanent things, destined to be slowly consumed by the relentless, silent march of time and the overwhelming forces of the environment that surrounds them. By the middle of January in the year 1493, the atmospheric machinery of the Northern Hemisphere was locked into its ancient, violent winter cycle, as the two remaining caravels, the Niña and the Pinta, finally turned their heavy wooden bows away from the lush green coastlines of Hispaniola and began to trace a path northward. They were sailing directly into a meteorological theater of profound and terrifying power. To cross the North Atlantic during the depths of winter is to challenge one of the most volatile and energy-dense oceanic environments on the planet. The Spanish pilots, relying on the rudimentary science of dead reckoning and the shifting patterns of the trade winds, correctly deduced that to return to the Iberian Peninsula, they needed to sail north to catch the prevailing westerlies. But in doing so, they unknowingly placed their fragile, leaking vessels directly in the path of massive, spiraling systems of low pressure that routinely detach from the frigid coasts of North America and sweep eastward across the dark water. Deep within the troposphere, a complex and invisible thermodynamic reaction was taking place, a massive descending wave of bitter, freezing air, borne over the immense ice sheets of Greenland and the Arctic Circle, violently collided with the warm, humid, energy-rich currents of the Gulf Stream pushing up from the equator. The friction between these two vastly different thermal masses generated a rapid, catastrophic drop in atmospheric pressure. The air began to rotate, spinning counterclockwise into a towering, multi-layered cyclone that stretched for hundreds of miles across the open ocean. To the modern meteorologist, this is a baroclinic anomaly, an extratropical cyclone of staggering proportions, a heat engine feeding off the latent energy of the ocean. To the exhausted, starving men aboard the two isolated ships, in the middle of February, it was simply the sudden, apocalyptic dissolution of the world they knew. The sky did not merely darken, it compressed, descending upon the ocean in a suffocating canopy of bruised, charcoal-gray clouds that obliterated the sun and the stars, robbing the pilots of any fixed reference point in the universe. The wind, initially a strong, steady push against the heavy canvas sails, rapidly escalated into a sustained and deafening roar, carrying with it a blinding horizontal sheet of freezing rain and atomized sea spray. The sheer mechanical force of the gale stripped the Pinta away in the darkness, leaving the Niña entirely alone, a tiny speck of carved wood and woven hemp suspended in a chaotic, three-dimensional geometry of collapsing water. The ocean surface lost all resemblance to a liquid plain, driven by winds exceeding hurricane force. The water was violently sculpted into towering, rogue waves, massive walls of black water tipped with churning white foam, some reaching the height of a modern 5-story building. Inside the cramped, completely unlit hull of the Niña, the biological and psychological reality of the crew had been reduced to an absolute, primal state of terror. The ship was barely 50 feet long, a fragile shell of pine and oak, held together by iron spikes and deteriorating ropes of hemp. As the vessel was lifted up the terrifyingly steep face of a massive swell, the entire wooden structure groaned and shrieked under the impossible torsion, only to plunge violently into the deep, breathless troughs between the waves. The air below decks was entirely devoid of light, thick with the sharp, metallic scent of ozone from the lightning strikes, the foul stench of vomit, decaying bilge water, and the suffocating odor of wet, unwashed wool. The men were thrown violently against the curved wooden ribs of the hull in absolute darkness, their muscles screaming from the sheer physical effort of holding onto ropes and stanchions to prevent their bones from shattering. The mathematical probability of survival was rapidly approaching zero. The seams of the ship, packed with oakum and hardened pitch, began to flex and open under the relentless, crushing pressure of the deep water, allowing freezing streams of the Atlantic to pour into the hold. The crew, operating in a state of delirious exhaustion, passed heavy leather buckets in a desperate, unending chain to bail the rising water, their hands bleeding and numb, fighting a slow, agonizing battle against the basic principles of buoyancy. In the paralyzing grip of this mechanical chaos, the men turned to the only architecture of hope they possessed, the rigid, deeply ingrained structures of their faith. Huddled in the dark, screaming to be heard over the roar of the ocean, they drew lots using dried chickpeas, one of which was marked with a cross carved by a knife. They made desperate, binding vows to walk barefoot to the shrines of saints if they were spared from the suffocating, dark abyss beneath them. In the small, incredibly unstable stern cabin, the commander of the expedition experienced a profound, existential terror that transcended the immediate biological fear of drowning. It was the agonizing, unbearable realization that the monumental paradigm shift he had initiated was about to be completely erased from the timeline of human history. If the Niña foundered and slipped beneath the cold, black waves, the entire expedition, the contact with the Taino on the maps of the complex island coastlines, and the proof of a reachable landmass across the Western Ocean would vanish without a single trace. The absolute silence of the Atlantic would swallow the greatest geographical revelation of the age, leaving the scholars and monarchs of Europe to permanently conclude that the Western Sea was indeed an unnavigable, deadly void. Driven by this crushing psychological weight, he engaged in a frantic, desperate act of preservation. Working by the dim, flickering light of a single enclosed lantern. Swinging violently from the overhead beams, he took a heavy sheet of parchment and rapidly summarized the entire history of the voyage. He detailed the islands, the people, the coordinates, and the invisible ocean currents that connected the two halves of the globe. He then tightly rolled this fragile, organic record, wrapped it meticulously in a thick, waterproof layer of waxed cloth, and sealed it within a heavy, iron-bound wooden barrel. Pushing his way out onto the completely submerged, chaotic main deck, fighting against the blinding spray and the hurricane-force winds, he cast the barrel into the churning black water, a blind, desperate message thrown into the void of the storm. When we shift our perspective away from the agonizing, microscopic reality of that single wooden ship and look down upon the vast planetary scale of the mid-Atlantic cyclone, the intense human drama completely dissolves into the quiet, indifferent mechanics of fluid dynamics. The storm is a colossal, spiraling fractal of kinetic energy, spinning slowly over thousands of square miles of ocean, completely unaware of the fragile, biological entities struggling to survive within its lower atmospheric layers. The massive, dark swells of water rise and fall according to the strict, ancient laws of gravity and friction, unbothered by the complex political and economic ambitions that drove those tiny wooden vessels out into the deep. The heavy wooden barrel, bobbing silently in the terrifying valleys between the waves, represents one of the most haunting intersections of chance and consequence in the human story. It is a lingering, melancholic thought that the entire architecture of the modern world, the massive, irreversible merging of two isolated hemispheres, and the complete rewriting of the planet's biological and cultural destiny, was at one point reduced to a few drops of ink on a piece of sheepskin, sealed in a decaying wooden cask, completely at the mercy of an indifferent ocean. History is not a rigid, inevitable, forward march of progress, permanently carved into stone. It is, at its very core, a fragile, deeply vulnerable thread, highly susceptible to the violent, chaotic weather of the natural world, constantly teetering on the edge of an absolute, silent abyss where profound truths can be lost forever in the dark. In the fading, pale light of early March, in the year 1493, the brutal, churning mechanics of the winter Atlantic finally yielded to the structured, muddy currents of the Tagus River estuary. The Nina, stripped entirely of her former aerodynamic grace, limped agonizingly toward the stone docks of Lisbon, Portugal. She was no longer a proud vessel of exploration. She was a battered, heavily traumatized survivor of a massive atmospheric war. Her heavy oak hull was crusted with sharp, calcified layers of gray barnacles and trailing long, decaying ribbons of green marine kelp. Her pine masts had been violently splintered by the hurricane winds and hastily bound with frayed, rotting hemp, and her immense canvas sails were reduced to stained, ragged patches, barely capable of catching the coastal breeze. The men who stood on her deeply scarred wooden deck were biologically exhausted, their bodies hollowed out by the agonizing onset of scurvy, the relentless cold, and the profound psychological terror of the mid-Atlantic cyclones. They stared out at the highly organized, geometric reality of the Iberian coastline with the hollow, unfocused eyes of men who had returned from an entirely different dimension of existence. The smell of the Portuguese air, a dense, comforting, terrestrial mixture of roasting meats, burning wood smoke, damp stone, and dry, stable earth, was a violent, intoxicating contrast to the sterile, atomized brine that had mercilessly filled their lungs for the past half-year. Below the bruised and leaking decks, resting in the suffocating dampness of the ship's hold, was a biological and geological cargo that simply did not belong anywhere within the established taxonomy of the Old World. There were brilliantly colored, shivering tropical parrots, huddled tightly in crude wooden cages, their vibrant green and red feathers dulled by the cold. There were woven baskets filled with dried, unrecognizable botanical specimens, and a small, tragic group of captive Taino people, physically deteriorating under the crushing weight of foreign pathogens in the freezing, alien European winter. Yet, the most explosive and dangerous item aboard the shattered caravel was not made of hammered gold or human flesh. It was a fragile, densely folded piece of parchment. In his cramped, water-stained stern cabin, the commander of the expedition had drafted a meticulous, highly calculated letter addressed to Luis de Santangel, the powerful royal finance minister who had organized the vast economic funding for the voyage. The physical document was small, written in the cramped, heavily abbreviated cursive script of the late 15th century, the dark iron gall ink biting deeply into the fibrous surface of the paper. It was an exercise in geopolitical marketing, deliberately exaggerating the wealth, the ease of conquest, and the docile nature of the native populations to ensure the massive financial debts of the expedition would be forgiven. In future, larger voyages would be immediately funded. When that single, folded letter was carried off the ship, out of the damp, salty air, and placed into the sophisticated, highly networked postal routes of Renaissance Europe, it intercepted a technological mechanism that would violently amplify its contents across the continent. Barely 4 decades earlier, the dissemination of information was a painfully slow, purely biological process, requiring monks or scholarly scribes to painstakingly copy heavy manuscripts by hand, one agonizing, silent page at a time. But by the spring of 1493, the intellectual and social landscape of Europe had been radically terraformed by the heavy industrial mechanics of the movable type printing press. Within weeks of the letter reaching the Spanish court in Barcelona, a master printer carefully arranged tiny, reverse-cast letters made of a rapidly cooling lead and antimony alloy into a tight, rectangular iron frame. He vigorously beat a pair of heavy leather balls, coated in a highly viscous, jet-black ink made from crushed soot and boiled linseed oil, applying the thick pigment evenly over the cold, raised metal type. A slightly damp sheet of soft rag paper was laid carefully across the frame, and a massive, threaded wooden screw was violently turned by the muscular force of the pressman, driving a heavy wooden platen down, pressing the paper against the ink with hundreds of pounds of mechanical pressure. This loud, rhythmic, heavily industrial process of stamping black ink onto pale paper was repeated hundreds, then thousands of times in rapid succession. The original Castilian letter was swiftly translated into a formal Latin text known as De Insulis Inventis, the universal language of the European educated elite. Like a highly contagious intellectual virus, the printed, unbound pamphlets exploded outward along the major ancient trade arteries, traveling in the damp leather saddlebags of exhausted couriers inside the locked iron strongboxes of wealthy merchants and in the deep woolen pockets of wandering scholars. In the span of a few short, chaotic months, the text reached the towering Gothic universities of Paris, the quiet, analytical banking houses of Florence, and the busy, mercantile printing shops of Rome, Basel, and Antwerp. The sheer, terrifying velocity of this information transfer was entirely unprecedented in the recorded history of human communication. A narrative that would have taken an entire century to whisper its way across the frozen mountain passes of the continent in the medieval era was now shouted to the masses in a matter of weeks, fundamentally destabilizing the established parameters of reality. In dimly lit, meticulously organized workshops across Europe, master cartographers unrolled massive sheets of pristine, scraped vellum and stared down at the strict, ancient, comforting geometries of the Ptolemaic world map. For over 1,000 years, the boundaries of the known Earth had been locked into a fixed, rigid, and deeply religious hierarchy. The Atlantic Ocean was not a space to be crossed. It was the absolute, terrifying edge of creation, the dark, unnavigable void where the physics of the world simply ceased to exist. Now, with the undeniable, mass-printed evidence resting heavily on their slanted, wooden drafting tables, these quiet, methodical scholars picked up their sharp metal compasses, their heavy brass astrolabes, and their fine-tipped goose quills, and began the terrifying, exhilarating process of physically erasing the edge of the world. They scraped away the thick ink of the old borders with rough pumice stones, and they were forced to draw entirely new, speculative lines out into the empty, terrifying margins of the parchment. They were attempting to mathematically comprehend a planet that had suddenly, inexplicably, doubled in its habitable volume. The geographical center of gravity for the human race was shifting violently westward, moving rapidly away from the ancient, enclosed, safe waters of the Mediterranean Sea and out into the terrifying, open expanse of the global ocean. The true, irreversible transformation of the planet did not actually occur in the physical mud of a Bahamian beach, nor did it happen in the violent, chaotic struggles of the returning wooden ships against the deep water. The absolute pivot point of human history happened in the quiet, dusty, ink-stained rooms of Europe, where the abstract concept of a completely new world was mechanically pressed into existence. It is a profound and deeply humbling meditation on the delicate nature of truth, realizing that reality itself is a highly malleable construct. A massive tectonic shift in the collective consciousness of the human species requires no physical force, no clashing armies, and no roaring cannons. It requires only the slow, methodical arrangement of dark pigment on a fragile sheet of paper, traveling quietly through the minds of millions until the boundaries of the old world simply fade away, replaced forever by the terrifying, infinite vastness of the new. In the late autumn of 1493, the dark, churning expanse of the Atlantic Ocean was no longer an incomprehensible void of terrifying isolation. It had been suddenly and violently transformed into a heavily trafficked maritime corridor. Less than a year after a single, battered caravel had limped back to the Iberian Peninsula with a fractured map and a handful of captive indigenous people, the waters were displaced by the massive, synchronized movement of an armada, 17 heavily armed vessels. A floating city of immense wooden architecture cut through the deep azure currents, pushed westward by the relentless force of the trade winds. This was not a fragile expedition of cautious discovery. It was a massive, industrialized apparatus of permanent occupation. Aboard these floating fortresses were over 1,200 men. They were hardened mercenaries from the reconquest of Granada, Franciscan friars holding tightly to heavy, silver-clasped Bibles, and desperate, landless nobility seeking the fabricated myths of golden cities. Deep within the dark, suffocating lower decks of this immense fleet, a biological payload of staggering proportions was suffering through the agonizing realities of the ocean crossing. This was a forced, unnatural migration of the old-world biosphere. Hundreds of massive, thick-coated Andalusian horses stood terrified in cramped wooden stalls, their hooves slipping violently against the wet oak planks with every massive swell of the ocean. There were tight, screaming pens of Iberian breeding pigs, flocks of sheep, and heavy, iron-bound casks overflowing with the seeds of wheat, barley, and sugarcane. The humid air trapped beneath the decks was a choking, toxic miasma of animal waste, decaying fodder, and unwashed human bodies. This fleet was carrying the aggressive, terraforming biological engines of the Eurasian landmass, destined to be unleashed upon a fragile island ecology that had existed in absolute, pristine isolation for millions of years. As the 17 ships approached the northern coastline of Hispaniola, under the heavy cover of a moonless night, the atmosphere was thick with a tense, almost unbearable anticipation. The commander of the Armada stood on the aft deck, his eyes straining against the absolute blackness of the tropical night, searching the familiar contour of the shoreline for the comforting, flickering orange glow of a European watchfire. He was looking for La Navidad, the crude wooden fortress built from the shattered remains of his original flagship, where he had left 39 men the previous winter. Finding nothing but the overwhelming, impenetrable darkness of the jungle, he ordered his gunners to load a massive bronze bombard. The heavy stone sphere was rammed down the barrel. The powder was ignited, and a deafening, catastrophic explosion of thunder and fire shattered the ancient silence of the Caribbean night. The acoustic shockwave rolled aggressively across the water, echoing against the distant mountain ridges, demanding an answer from the men who had been left behind. The ocean and the island absorbed the violent sound and then returned to a profound, suffocating silence. There was no answering cannon fire. There was no light. There was only the gentle, indifferent lapping of the waves against the heavy, wooden hulls and the haunting, nocturnal hum of millions of unseen insects in the dense forest canopy. When the pale, bruised light of the morning sun finally broke across the horizon, it illuminated a scene that would permanently shatter the fragile, constructed illusions of the European mind. Heavy wooden longboats were lowered into the turquoise water, and heavily armored men rowed frantically toward the white sand beach. As their heavy leather boots compressed the earth, the humid, tropical air carried the faint, unmistakable chemical signature of ancient ash and oxidized iron. They pushed their way through the thick, encroaching vines of the coastal overgrowth and found the absolute, undeniable reality of La Navidad. The fortress was completely eradicated. The heavy oak timbers, salvaged with such desperate effort from the sunken Santa Maria, had been burned to the ground, reduced to charred, blackened stumps, rapidly decomposing into the soft, tropical earth. Scattered among the ashes and the rapidly growing jungle weeds were the pathetic, decaying remnants of the European presence. There were torn fragments of heavy Castilian cloth rotting in the mud, shattered clay, apothecary jars, and rusted, useless sheets of hammered iron armor. But the most devastating discovery lay buried in the shallow soil and submerged in the nearby coastal waters. The search parties found the physical bodies of the 39 men. They were in advanced stages of biological decomposition, their remains showing the undeniable forensic evidence of extreme targeted violence. Their eyes were gone, consumed by the relentless scavengers of the tropics, and their limbs were bound tightly with thick, native Maho cordage. The men who had been left behind to hold a continent had been completely and systematically annihilated. The forensic reconstruction of the preceding months painted a dark, deeply inherent portrait of human nature when stripped of the strict, governing hierarchies of society. The 39 men of La Navidad had not remained the disciplined, stoic guardians of a new frontier. Trapped in a psychological vacuum, surrounded by an environment they did not understand, and driven by a deeply ingrained, toxic greed, they had rapidly fractured into violent, competing factions. They had abandoned the relative safety of their wooden walls, roaming aggressively into the deep interior of the island, demanding gold from the indigenous communities and committing unspeakable acts of violence and assault against the Taino women. In doing so, they had triggered the massive, highly organized immune response of the indigenous society. The Taino were not the mythical, purely docile inhabitants of a fabricated Eden that the Europeans had written about in their widely printed pamphlets. They were complex, intelligent human beings, fully capable of sophisticated, lethal self-defense. A powerful cacique from the deep interior, a man named Kaunabo, had observed the atrocities, calculated the strategic vulnerabilities of the isolated Europeans, and launched a massive, coordinated military strike. Under the cover of darkness, thousands of indigenous warriors had swept over the fortress, setting the dry oak timbers ablaze and violently erasing the toxic, invading presence from their shores. The burning of La Navidad was the absolute, fiery end to the brief, naive illusion that the merging of these two hemispheres would be a peaceful, unquestioned submission. Unable to remain at the site of this profound psychological and physical defeat, the massive armada pulled its anchors and sailed further east along the jagged coastline. Desperate to establish a permanent foothold, they selected a dense, heavily forested bay and immediately began the frantic, chaotic construction of a new settlement, naming it La Isabela. They dragged heavy, pre-cut limestone blocks from the ships to build a church, a fortified storehouse, and a residence for the governor, attempting to aggressively stamp the rigid, geometric architecture of the Old World directly onto the soft, shifting soils of the tropics. But the environment instantly and violently rejected this massive biological intrusion. The seeds of European wheat and barley, planted with desperate hope in the lush, humid earth, shot up rapidly in the intense heat, only to wither and die without ever producing grain, entirely unsuited to the specific chemical composition of the soil. The hundreds of Iberian pigs, released into the surrounding forests to forage, multiplied at a terrifying rate, carrying with them unseen, highly contagious zoonotic pathogens. Within weeks, a catastrophic epidemic, likely a form of swine influenza or malaria, swept through the densely packed, unsanitary confines of La Isabela, dropping hundreds of heavily armored men into agonizing, feverish graves. It was a profound, deeply tragic irony of the biological exchange. Surrounded by a lush ecosystem capable of producing tens of thousands of calories through the indigenous cultivation of cassava and sweet potatoes, the Europeans began to starve to death, hopelessly tethered to the agricultural memory of a world an ocean away. When we pull our perspective back from the charred, skeletal remains of La Navidad and the disease-ridden, failing stone walls of La Isabela, the localized human tragedy expands into a massive planetary realization. The destruction of that first wooden fort and the desperate, violent grounding of the second settlement were the agonizing, physical stitches binding the two separated halves of the globe together. The ancient, unfathomable geographic isolation of the American landmass, held safely behind a moat of millions of square miles of dark water, since the fracturing of the supercontinent Pangaea, was completely and permanently undone. There is a profound, solemn weight to the understanding that time is an absolutely unidirectional force, completely indifferent to the regrets or the agonies of the human species. When the heavy wooden doors of history are violently blown off their iron hinges by the sheer, relentless momentum of exploration and greed, there is no mechanism in the universe that allows them to be closed again. The ashes of La Navidad, mixing slowly with the white sand of the beach, represented a permanent, irreversible scar on the timeline of the Earth. Two entirely different lineages of humanity, two completely isolated evolutionary biospheres, were now locked into a chaotic, terrifying embrace, destined to reshape the chemical, biological, and cultural foundation of the entire planet, forever unable to return to the quiet, undisturbed silence of the world that existed before the ships arrived. To truly comprehend the monumental scale of what was set into motion during the final decade of the 15th century, we must completely detach our perspective from the fragile, temporary struggles of individual human beings. We must zoom out beyond the rotting timbers of stranded ships, beyond the desperate political ambitions of European monarchs, and beyond the tragic, localized violence of the early coastal settlements. We must look down upon the Earth from the silent, freezing vacuum of space and observe the planet as a single, massive, biological entity. For hundreds of millions of years, ever since the ancient supercontinent of Pangaea slowly tore itself apart under the immense tectonic pressure of the Earth's mantle, the great landmasses of the world had drifted away from one another. They were separated by millions of square miles of deep, uncrossable oceanic trenches, creating two entirely distinct, isolated laboratories of evolution. The flora and fauna of the Americas and the biological machinery of the Eurasian and African landmasses had developed in absolute, pristine isolation, following completely divergent genetic pathways. When those heavy wooden caravels finally breached the Atlantic void, they did not merely connect two maps. They violently crashed these two ancient biological laboratories together, initiating a planetary event so profound that modern ecologists refer to it as the beginning of the Homogenocene, the era of biological homogenization. The most powerful and enduring legacy of 1492 was not the transfer of hammered gold or the redrawing of political boundaries. It was the slow, quiet, and absolutely unstoppable transfer of microscopic seeds, heavy tubers, and living, breathing mammals. High in the frigid, terraced peaks of the Andean mountain range, indigenous farmers had spent millennia meticulously cultivating a staggering variety of a humble, dense root vegetable. The potato was an absolute marvel of biological engineering, capable of thriving in thin, freezing air and rocky, nutrient-poor soil where no European crop could possibly survive. When the heavy, dirt-encrusted tubers of the potato were carried back across the ocean and introduced into the wet, cold, and heavy clay soils of northern Europe, they triggered a silent, agricultural shockwave. A single acre of planted potatoes could produce entirely unprecedented yields of complex carbohydrates, providing enough caloric energy to sustain a massive explosion in the European population. This single, unassuming biological import fundamentally shifted the demographic center of gravity in the Old World, effectively pulling Europe out of its cycles of devastating medieval famines and providing the raw, biological fuel that would eventually power the towering, smoke-belching factories of the Industrial Revolution. At the very same time, the meticulously engineered seeds of Mesoamerican maize were loaded into the dark, humid holds of returning galleons. Corn, a towering grass that had been patiently coaxed from small, wild teosinte plants by ancient indigenous botanists over thousands of years, possessed an incredible photosynthetic efficiency. As these kernels were traded and planted along the vast, ancient networks of the African continent and deep into the rural provinces of Ming Dynasty China, they transformed the agricultural carrying capacity of the entire planet. The sheer volume of calories suddenly available to the global population altered the trajectory of human reproduction and survival on every single habitable continent. Yet, this massive global exchange of organic matter operated in both directions. And the biological wave that washed over the Americas was equally transformative, though physically much larger and frequently devastating. When the heavily armored Spanish ships unloaded their cargo onto the shores of the New World, they brought creatures that the isolated ecosystems of the Americas had not seen since the massive mammalian extinctions of the last ice age. The hooves of Andalusian horses touched the rich, deep soils of the American plains, and within a few short generations, these animals went feral, multiplying rapidly in the vast, unbroken oceans of native grasses. The introduction of the horse fundamentally rewrote the ecological balance of the continent. Indigenous societies that had spent thousands of years as nomadic pedestrians, moving slowly across the immense, arid landscapes, captured and mastered these powerful animals. They rapidly transformed into highly mobile, incredibly dominant equestrian cultures, fundamentally altering their hunting patterns, their territorial boundaries, and their entire sociological relationship with the immense geography of the plains. Cattle, sheep, and pigs multiplied with terrifying, unchecked velocity in an environment entirely devoid of their natural, old-world predators. They aggressively consumed the native flora, trampling the delicate, highly specialized ecosystems of the wetlands and the forests, aggressively terraforming the landscape to mirror the agricultural aesthetics of the Iberian Peninsula. And moving silently beneath all of this visible, macroscopic upheaval was the devastating microscopic tide of Eurasian pathogens, the invisible viral and bacterial agents that had crossed the ocean within the lungs and bloodstreams of the European sailors, swept through the immense, complex civilizations of the Americas with a mathematical ruthlessness The catastrophic collapse of the indigenous populations was so massive, so absolutely unprecedented in the history of the human species, that it left a physical, geological scar on the planet itself, as tens of millions of indigenous people perished from smallpox, measles, and influenza. The vast, meticulously managed agricultural lands, the massive Canuco mounds, and the ancient, cleared forests were suddenly abandoned. Without human intervention, the aggressive, relentless biology of the tropical and temperate forests rapidly reclaimed the earth. Millions of acres of trees grew wildly back over the empty cities and silent fields, drawing so much carbon dioxide out of the global atmosphere that it triggered a measurable drop in planetary temperatures, a chilling of the earth that modern glaciologists can still read today in the deep, frozen ice cores extracted from the Antarctic sheets. The year 1492 was not merely a date recorded in the dusty, decaying ledgers of human history. It was a massive, irreversible pivot point in the biological and geological narrative of the Earth itself. It was the absolute, chaotic end of the planet's long, quiet isolation, and the violent birth of a unified, deeply entangled biosphere. Everything that followed, the rise and fall of global empires, the massive, forced migrations of millions of human beings, and the complex, industrialized world we inhabit today, is built entirely upon the shifting, unstable foundation of that single, monumental collision of ecologies. The world that existed before those three wooden ships drifted into the shallow, turquoise waters of the Lucayan archipelago is gone forever, swallowed by the relentless, unidirectional flow of time, leaving only faint, genetic echoes and buried, calcified ruins hidden beneath the earth. As the sheer, overwhelming scale of this planetary transformation slowly settles into the quiet spaces of the room around you, you can allow the vast, heavy tapestry of human history to gently loosen its grip on your mind. Let the towering, splintered masts of the sinking ships, the bright, perfectly spherical glass beads resting on the white sand, and the quiet, meticulously engineered agricultural mounds of the ancient islands begin to blur and fade away into the soft, comforting darkness of the present moment. The massive, churning cyclones of the Atlantic and the quiet, ink-stained rooms of the European mapmakers are now thousands of miles and hundreds of years away from the safety of where you rest. You do not need to hold on to the weight of these centuries. You do not need to remember the specific dates, the intricate turning gears of the navigational tools, or the names of the men who stood trembling on the edge of the unknown. All of those complex, chaotic struggles have long since dissolved into the deep, silent current of the past, leaving you completely tethered to the calm, steady rhythm of your own breathing in the quiet of the night. If you're still awake and you've enjoyed drifting through this piece of the past, you can gently tap the like button or subscribe. But for now, you don't need to do anything at all. Rest well. Good night.